Never let a trilogy go unfinished is, I don't think, a thing people say, but anyways, Infected Moonlight. So this is the I say last. This is the current most recent book in the Tainted Moonlight series by Erin Kelly. I was commissioned to take a look at these books by the author herself. I've done earlier reviews of each of them. I was more positive on the first one than the second, though there was good stuff in both. This one is meant to kind of be a climax, although it is made very plain by the end that there are intended to be more, although there is not currently a fourth book. And whether or not it will focus specifically on the same main characters in future, it's hard to know. I imagine they'll continue to appear, whatever she decides to do. And what I will say is that there's certainly much more to be done in this setting and these worlds and with some of these characters, not even necessarily the main ones. There are more places to go, more things to explore that have been introduced and are brought up in this book in particular. That having been said, I've probably got more issues than strong points. The first problem is a near total absence of my favorite part of the first two books. My favorite parts in both books had to do with how the main pair, that being Sophie and Corbin, behaved and were written about and described, and how the narrative was brought across when they were in wolf form. That stuff was always so good, and there is, I don't know if it's actually the least amount by word count, but it certainly feels like the least amount of that material here. And it shows up in the front end and never circles back again. And it's really, really disappointing for someone who not only really liked that stuff, but thinks it was genuinely great. It's not just that it was the best things in the books. I thought it was like legitimately great, not even on a scale. That was great material. And Kelly writes it really, really well. And there's very, very little of it here. So that's my first frustration. Some of the things are not actually necessarily problems with the book so much as things with my taste. I'll avoid out and out spoilers until later, but I'm going to have to talk about the back end and talk about some things. But like, just broadly speaking, we deal much more upfront with a love triangle that has been set up more or less across the course of the first two, but this is the first time that love triangle dynamic is really in play. And while I don't think it's a badly handled love triangle, and in fact there are some things about it that I like a lot more than a lot of love triangles, the big one being that the one that obviously Sophie is not going to pick isn't as demonized as I've often seen these sorts of things do it, and that's just nice in terms of balance. But the fact that I use the phrase obviously not going to pick actually kind of brings me a bit to my core issue with a lot of love triangle stories. So this is less a criticism of saying this is a bad love triangle, rather than it kind of solidified in my mind one of the reasons I don't love triangles. And that has to do with the fact that it's a little bit of a tangent. This isn't actually a specific criticism of the book, but it's an aspect that's in the book that it made me realize this. So I kind of want to share this. The problem with me for love triangles is they almost never, I'm not going to say definitely never, but they almost never actually present a legitimate conflict with stakes in terms of who is she going to pick. And I'm saying she because that is the standard love triangle format. Yes, technically you can have love triangles in any gender combination, but like, let's be honest, by and large, it is a woman with two men pursuing her, and she's torn between them. That is the standard format. And so like, this criticism is largely about that standard format, which is also the format that's in the book. So the thing is, the way that most writers try to have it presented as the conflict is that there's one who is the logistical love, the one that it makes sense to stay with on all these logistical levels. They are better off. They're more stable. Oftentimes, if there is an existing relationship, that's the existing relationship. So like you're already in a marriage or you already have a kid, et cetera, et cetera. So like the logistical arguments all favor one person, but who the character is actually in love with is the other person in the love triangle. And no love triangle ever has the heroine pick anybody other than the one that she's actually in love with, unless it's going for a tragic framing. And then it might go the other way, or might have her pick the romantic love and just have it go really, really, really badly. But like that's 99.9% of the time, it is insanely obvious, because while the format is trying to give like, well, here's the one that like makes sense for a future life, but here's the one she's actually in love with, like narratively, for the sake of narrative satisfaction, you don't not go for the one you're actually in love with. That's what is narratively satisfying. That's why there is no tension and almost no interest for me in a love triangle. I'm sure there are some that handle it better than that, but at least grant me that the standard template, like you know immediately who she's going to go for. That having been said, one of the things that is very common in those that this book doesn't do is to take the logistical love and like, it turns out that they're cheating. It turns out that they are secretly violent, or they're overly possessive, or like in some way, like quantifiably a worse person than the romantic love. This doesn't really do that. And I do appreciate that at least. Beyond that, okay, so this is, I'm going to call this light spoilers right now. If there has been a consistent issue for me in these books, it has been the villains. There have been villains in all three books. None of them have really worked. And oddly, it's been for different reasons each time. So in the first book, the villain was introduced like at the very end, and it was super rushed. And it was like, wait a minute, what? Not like in a shock way, but like, wait, this is what we're doing? Really? Like there was a little bit of setup because there'd been some intrigue before, but the answers in the actual introduction of what was going on, like the whole villain aspect of that felt rushed. Second book, the villain was given a lot more time, but felt deeply generic in terms of just embodying a host of very, very, very common stereotypes used to depict serial killer or sociopathic characters, and there did not seem to be a lot to him other than that. Villain issue in this one is not what was the case in either of the previous. Well, actually, I take that back. It's a little bit of the issue from the first book in that by the time we get to the full explanation of what's actually going on, it does seem kind of rushed because it introduced twists on twist on twist. And like one of the twists undoes the previous twist because it's a different twist. Like it was kind of overload at the tail end. But even setting that similarity aside, the weird thing about this one is, well, is that I would say out of the three books, both the first and the third one didn't need a villain. Not like as a person, as an individual. The circumstances were villainous enough, were enough complication that you didn't need a human. Well, I'd say human, but you didn't need a character to personify the villainy. And also, these characters generally don't. I would say, as much as he didn't work for me, Davy in the second book has a much bigger justification for being there because it is specifically him that's causing all the problems. Whereas there's plenty of problems, there's plenty of tension, there's plenty of stuff to build a story around, there's plenty of complications, all logistical. In the first book, you've got Sophie's, initial infection turning Wolven, and all of the stuff that is going on there, and how it's new, and how, who can they safely tell, what resources, who's in danger, and to what degree, and they're in danger from police, they can be put back in quarantine, separate. Like there's plenty of stuff. It didn't need a human villain. This time, kind of similarly, because they're back in civilization again, and those same complications are there. There are the issues around characters we basically haven't seen since the first book, like Lucas, Sophie's husband, or all the existing laws that restrict the rights of werewolves. And then there's a whole new wrinkle added in with the confirmed presence of vampires, which was hinted at in earlier books. Stick a pin in that. I'll come back to it. It's not solidly there, but it is more interesting and definitely something that can be built on later. So like I'll get back to that when I'm a little bit off the complaint train. But there's plenty going on that does not require an evil cackling villain. And that's, again, part of the problem. Whereas the last one very much fell into the template of sociopathic serial killer archetypes, the villain this time falls under the template of person was broken and now is a monster. And that's really hard to balance. And if it works, it rarely works as a twist surprise reveal, because it kind of, the idea of somebody going through something so terrible that it turns them fundamentally into a monster that they weren't already before that thing happened to them, you have to be really careful how you do that. And while I don't think this necessarily is a particularly harmful depiction of that concept in terms of, I don't think it makes any particularly egregious presumptions or implications in regards to mental health or PTSD or anything else. It is still leaning on that core fundamental idea of they went through something bad enough that now they're just a monster. And that idea is already kind of a problem, even though this book doesn't indulge in like some of the worst ways to push that into it being a problem. But so that there's that as well. And the villain just, and the villain monologues, like, as much as I didn't care for Davy in the second book, I got why he monologued. It made sense for his personality. I have no idea why this villain is monologuing. Well, no, I do. It's exposition in the form of a villain monologue. But like internally, within the scene, I don't get it. And ultimately, what really frustrated me about this villain is by the time it's all said and done, this villain isn't even Corbin or Sophie's villain. This villain is the antagonist of a new character who's been introduced and really has almost nothing to do with Sophie and Corbin. Like, things have gone in such a way that like everybody's gotten wrapped up together, but like this isn't the villain to their story. This is a villain to somebody else's story, somebody else who has stumbled into this. And that just like, and the climax bears that out, because Sophie participates a little, Corbin barely at all, but ultimately they're not the ones who take care of this. The person whose villain this actually is has a lot more to do with how this ultimately gets resolved. So, all right, backing up. I mentioned that there are vampires in this one. There's also a twist related to that comes in about halfway into the book, which I didn't call specifically, but the core element of it I called very early on, just because the book brought extra attention to a detail that had been mentioned in the previous books, but kind of glossed over. But this book in the early early part brought it up again and then reemphasized it several more times in a way that I'm like, okay, that definitely means something. And while I didn't call the exact specifics of the nature of the twist, I'd say I called about half of it. That, you're bringing this up because suddenly the thing involved in what you're bringing up is going to make an appearance when we would have assumed it would not have. And it was an incidental detail before. And I did call that. So like there's that as well. And I would say that's a better handled twist. Although ultimately, for the purposes of this story, not an especially meaningful one. Because, again, this twist and the resulting information that comes from it has very little direct impact on this story. I suspect it's something that would be picked up on probably a lot in the hypothetical future continuation that I do believe is being worked on. But as of right now, within the confines of this story, it's a twist that ultimately has no impact on the actual narrative being told right now. And while this is a continuing series and you can kind of give a little leeway on that, it kind of treats it in that way, like when you're watching a TV show and you see an episode like midway through the season that introduces a character who doesn't do much but is going to do stuff later in the same season. It's the writing presents it like it's like that, but the thing is, a book series isn't like that. Even though it is still a series, like when you do it in the middle of a season of a television show, like, okay, well, we just have to wait till the end of the season. This right now, dropping it into what really felt like it was supposed to be more or less a resolution of a trilogy for the most part, that just makes it feel like nothing but setup. And certain formats, certain mediums, you can get away with that's nothing but setup better than in others. And I don't think it works as well in written form. So I mentioned vampires are a thing now. They're actually kind of interesting how they're deployed, how they are brought into it. The vampire characters I largely liked. There is, however, another character. There's another werewolf character brought in named Naraka, who I didn't especially care for actually a very similar reason to why there was a character in the last book, Frecky, I think it was. There was a character I complained about in the previous book, basically because his response to any interaction with Sophie was to flirt with her, even after she told him he was uncomfortable with that. Naraka basically does the same thing, except towards Corbin, because Naraka is gay, which, nice. There are actually multiple same-sex couples going on in the story at this point, and like, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But I have the same problem with Naraka that I had with Frecky, which is that, like, dude, he said he's not comfortable when you talk to him like that. Stop talking to him like that. And yes, I understand Naraka even flatly offers up, like, this is kind of a defense mechanism. It's my default of how I act. Like, I get it, dude, but, like, just stop. If you can't think of anything else to say, then just be quiet. Don't keep doing that. He said he's not comfortable. That was real frustrating. Especially because Naraka's his part in the story and his character's arc is actually pretty interesting. I just was a little bit detached from it because I was so frustrated by his continuing to do that. But this is a series that overall has just kind of been frustrating for me by this point. The first book I do feel was the strongest because it had the best focus, and it also was about the only one that ended in a way that actually would have been okay with it, like that actually being an ending. As much as the villain bit of it was rushed, the fact that the first book ended with them in wolf form running off into the wild, I honestly would have been happy to assume, and that's now the life they're going to lead. And I would have been okay with that. The books since then have had varying degrees of, well, obviously there has to be more. And so the level of satisfaction in these conclusions hasn't been particularly high. So that's a little bit of an issue. I need to do some more flat out spoilers. So I've done kind of mid-level spoilers and kind of talked around some stuff. I need to talk about some stuff flat out. So if you are interested in these books, or if you like the previous two, give it a shot. I would say if you like the first two, there's definitely no reason why you wouldn't like this, because for me, a lot of my frustrations with this mirror frustrations I had in either the first or the second or both. So now that we are into spoiler talk, all right, so Maverick is the villain. It's this whole shape-shifting thing. And what I meant when I said there was twist on twist on twist was initially we have a villain revealed, and it's General Kane. And General Kane was a character who already wasn't working because he's introduced at this panel where, like, they're discussing what to do about laws around werewolves. And he is so aggressively clearly has a prejudice against the werewolves that he was already immediately unreasonable, unlikable. I'm like, oh, you're the villain. I didn't necessarily call cackling cartoon villain, but I'm like, okay, you're the villain. Later, we get a flashback involving him because Corbin now has, well, basically the same powers Horse developed in Centaur World. He now has backstory vision. And so we get a look at the general at an earlier point, and his characterization there didn't really match what happened later. And I caught that early on. I thought that was just a writing error. Now, there is ultimately an explanation of that, which is the general who was at the panel is, in fact, a shapeshifter. That's Maverick. That's the person with the connections to Naraka, because he's Naraka's villain. He's not Corbin's. He's not Sophie's. But so that did explain that shift in characterization, but it was like a double twist because we get to the villain confrontation, which also, even the setup for that confrontation kind of happens out of nowhere. The villain basically calls up and goes, hey, come over to this address so we can have a final confrontation. Okay, bye. And they get there, and it's a shapeshifter, and it's like General Kane. And then it turns out, no, it's not. It's this person from Naraka's past, who, again, we know from backstory vision. And, it's just twist on twist. I'm just sitting there going, what is going on? And like all of it does get explained, but the way that it's all crammed together and how quickly it all happens just left me bewildered and befuddled more than anything else. And part of the problem that results of this is an under-exploration of Maverick and his motives, since we don't get really any deeper explanation of him other than what he went through broke him. It makes him a lot shallower than he could have been. I honestly don't get why he's doing what he's doing. Especially because if he's been doing it for as long as it's kind of implied he's been doing it, like he should have been caught or like something well before this, because he is not cautious. Like, he has a lot of abilities, but he's not cautious at all. So that didn't work. The thing that I called was Ace being alive. That was Corbin's best friend, who was with him when he got bitten and turned. And they brought extra attention to, oh, yes, Ace. I miss Ace. I'm like, okay, so Ace is going to turn out to be alive. I didn't call that Ace was going to be a vampire necessarily, but I did absolutely call that Ace was going to be alive, and he is. But ultimately, Ace doesn't matter to this story. He's revealed. It's like a kind of interesting twist, but like he doesn't do anything. It's confirmed he's around. He does almost nothing but be mysterious and set up stuff that could be picked up again, later on down the line. I'm actually a little bit annoyed at like a tiny note with Lucas at the end, because as I said, Lucas is the other part of the love triangle, if you didn't already guess. And I liked that as it was becoming clear that Sophie was in love with Corbin, and like she and Lucas had problems in their marriage even before Corbin showed up. I really liked that Lucas appeared to be somebody who was, prepared to break off pursuit, accept what it was she wanted, even if it wasn't what he wanted. But then there's like a tiny bit at the very end that hints like he's secretly plotting how to get her back. And I was like, oh, come on. And that actually really frustrated me, because it undercut something that I genuinely liked and was happy about. So that was frustrating. There's also this whole thing with Corbin, and it turns out that his father, his absentee father, is like a senator, and that is a reveal that also has basically no impact on the story. It's just another thing that's revealed, and I wasn't even shocked by it. I was just confused, because I'm not saying that can't be the case, but why are we dealing with this? This has very little bearing on what's going on. And like logistically it's in there a little, because like the idea that the senator has an interest in what's going on in Syracuse like kind of has to do with the villain's motives, his very poorly defined motives. But like it's real thin. It's real thin, and it doesn't support that as a reveal. Oh, and I also need to follow up on, so in the last book, I had complained about this whole additional aspect and element that was introduced to Corbin that really seemed to be leaning on the very deeply outdated idea of alpha wolves. And my issue when I brought it up there was, first of all, alpha wolves are a completely disproven theory, disproven by the guy who originally floated the theory. And when you are basing your werewolves so much on real wolves, then like I think that should matter. But even if I disregard that, the way it was being presented and worked didn't even match up with how alpha theory worked. And what I said in my criticism of that in the second book was that if this turns out to not be an alpha wolf thing, then my criticism is it's presented in a way that led me to think that it was that. It should have been clear about what it actually was. Or it was actually going to turn out to be an alpha wolf thing, and my original criticism stood. It turned out to be the latter. It does actually get named as an alpha thing, which, even setting aside that it's a debunked theory, the way this is working here that's not what alphas are. That's not how that works. So, and again, it's not like you can't make up your own rules. Like you can. Erin Kelly, any writer, you can make up your own rules. If you decide that what an alpha is in your fiction is different from what it is in any other fiction, or indeed in reality when the theory wasn't debunked, that's fine. But I kind of need you to address that. I kind of needed somebody to be like, wait, that's why are we calling this alpha qualities? Because that's not really how it works, is it? And then, just like that would be the clunkiest way to do it, but like in some way acknowledge, because when you're banking off a pop culture understanding of something that isn't even accurate to what that thing is, it's at best kind of befuddling. And again, I do want to emphasize, I think there's a lot more to be done in this setting. I think the world and the elements and the factions involved, especially with the introduction of vampires, are pretty good, pretty interesting. It's a fertile ground for a lot more stories. So I still think there's a decent amount of promise in what I've read from this series. There's also been a lot of frustration with some of the specific choices in terms of narrative and some of the specific character beats. Oh, one more thing related to villains. And I don't know why this is there either. They have Nikki, who was the twist villain from the first book, wake up from also Sophie's sister, wake up from a coma and have that notorious plot convenient amnesia, the kind that wipes out a very specific portion of memory. So now Nikki doesn't remember what she did. And I don't know what to make of that at all. Like, the reveal that Nikki's still alive happens early enough that I was kind of expecting it to pay off, but it doesn't really. Like, the payoff, I guess if it's the payoff, is that she doesn't remember. But again, that has no impact on this story. So again, maybe it's something that's meant to be set up for later stuff, but at that point we've piled up like 3 or 4 things that feel like they are just meant to be paid off later and aren't actually contributing to this particular narrative. And while I think you can get away with 1, maybe 2 of those, this is too many, because we've got the hint that Lucas is still going to keep pursuing Sophie regardless of what he has said out loud. We have the introduction of the vampires and the idea of Ace as the master vampire and however that works. We've got all this new status quo, or at least working towards revising into a new status quo for the legal state of werewolves and how that'll work going forward, and how Corbin, as the now officially designated Alpha of Syracuse, will work into that. But now we've also got Nikki still alive and how that is going to impact Sophie. And we've got all this background of government and military experimentation, which could also theoretically be picked up on. Like these are too many threads for later. And really the only one of those that I mentioned that feels like it gets much clean resolution here, or the closest thing to resolution, is that last one, because that has to do with Naraka and Maverick's story. So there is definitely still stuff to like here. And as I said, if you did like the first 2, I think you would like this one. But my favorite thing was pared down to practically nil. There was so little of what I loved the most in the first 2 books. And what was left either was playing in narrative and tropes that I just don't have an inclination towards in the first place, like love triangles, or it was doing stuff that just, for other reasons, wasn't quite landing right. And I don't like saying that, knowing for a fact that because she commissioned me, the author is going to see this video. But I warned her when I took the commission, like, I'm going to be honest. And if stuff isn't working, I'm going to say so. I'm trying very hard to not be mean. I don't want to be mean or unfair, but I was quite frustrated in working my way through this. And that's the reality of my experience as a reader on this. Or listener, because I listened to it on audiobook. And yeah, I'll reiterate, I still... I feel bad saying this for the narrator, but like He's very good at the narration. And he's pretty good at most of the characters, but the performance choices whenever he voices Sophie really, really yanks me out of things. But that's also part of why I didn't dwell on Sophie as a character, because I actually think Sophie is pretty strongly written. And I don't mean like strong woman. I mean like as a character, she's pretty well handled here, but you know, you wouldn't necessarily know that from the narration performance and the acting choices made. But anyways, I guess that'll wrap it up. While I said there is another book in the works for this series, I am probably done with it unless Erin Kelly wants to commission me to read more. And I do absolutely wish her the best of luck with any future things set in this setting, in this universe, because there's clearly been a lot of thought to put into it. And there's plenty of stuff about this setting that is intriguing and could really lend itself to some interesting stories. I just don't think that, other than the first one was hitting those the best. And it's kind of, maybe it's that I'm just not as invested in Corbin and Sophie as it demands. But then again, like a lot of what bugged me about it didn't even tie back to them. I don't know, but like there's plenty to do in this setting. There's plenty of stuff, whether you have these characters show up as the main focus or whether you have them cameo in a story about new characters dealing in this setting. I think there's plenty of space to keep exploring this and get some good stuff out of it. And I wish the best of luck. I'm also kind of ready to be done personally. But again, that has at least as much to do with personal taste in genre works as anything else. This turned into a longer review than I had intended to, but there we go. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon's what pays the bills around here. It is how I was commissioned to review the book. But even if you can't support me there, like, share, and subscribe. They also help. But even if you can't do that, don't worry too much about it. We take a relaxed attitude around here, so you can come on back next time you need a break. All right, time to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Emu Delkey, Leotha Boyd, Toy Loli, Becky Sparks, Fernobulax, The Poodle, Zach, Bookworm, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Shayla Gourlay, Brendan LaRose, and TT. Thank you for your support. If you want to hear me try and say your name while this little guy tries to chew on my earrings, well, you can check out the Patreon for the support tiers that get you a shout out. Thanks so much. You are a pain in my butt.